You good?
Alright. My process of being has ended, my process of becoming has started. Contention 1 is expedition. Korean immigration has been kept a secret in Mexican history. Yearly Age of Knowledge tells us her story of how their forces suffered hostages as foreigners in a foreign country. That's civilian 2007. There's part of Mexican history which has been kept a secret. Hundreds of Koreans are forced living in hostages. They could never imagine sacrifices that they would be forced to make. Yearly ignited without grandparents and family members. So it's given those hard labor. He talks about grandparents living and suffering in a foreign country. Those who refuse to work for being, what's your last name? And they will say, there is no such last name, so we all change the name. Now, these slaves represent the myth of the amount of miners. Through the innate Korean immigrants were recognized as the best worker, but excluded tree like Bruce due to their identity. That's June 2009 when they left their homeland for a strange country. Among us, 130 Koreans. Not one would see the beautiful mountains of the home country ever again. The first Korean immigrants lived in America, nicknamed anybody a captain. Japanese slave traders disguised came to Tulsa to take Koreans to work on slavery plantation. They were sold as slaves to cash plantation owners and land factories. And they laid large words in those with a diligence under a reputation that's the best worker. So much that they're given the nickname and the claim, but the myth is alive and well in current society. The Asian Americans vindicate the American dream. They are living proof of the power of the free market and the absence of racial discrimination. But this is problematic for some Asian American groups. The plight of the South Asian refugee gets lost in the averaging. Southeast Asia are lumped into the broader congregation as Surpaku 2002. The model by Norman's persistently legal and sort of so attached to the Asian American becomes a dog's right. The myth tells a regional and stereotype society working. The flip side is also appealing right because Asian American society from their strong families and dedication to educating hard. Conservatives say that the poverty of Latinos and Africans must be explained by their own values. The myth races love to hold out a sense of point of history. After the immigration reforms idea was selectively allowed numbers of educated immigrants into the United States, highly skilled Southeast Asian nurses, doctors, and engineers began pouring just as racial tension or out of universities. Articles charming a timely approach of hundreds of billions of the special upland minorities. The nation 300,000 Chinese Americans are moving ahead of the whole with no help from anyone else. Newsweek 1971, Asian Americans outlined the whites in the 1988 Dublin a super minority. Asian Americans are living proof of the power of free market after racial discrimination. A closer look paints another picture. What most are likely to do today are those about half the population of Asians are the Americans are made up of highly educated immigrants. The plight of refugees from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam gets lost in the averaging. Disadvantage have devastating effects on their lives inside the United States. Poverty rates among South Asian Americans are much higher than those of even non-minorities. Yet despite a clear and accurate screen by London population together, the federal government still groups South Asian refugees under the overall category Asian for research and funding purposes. We've labored under the shadow of the monoliths for so long, so people don't even know the specific needs and contributions to our communities, but the violence is silent. The right covers up the exception to uphold the modern myths. As for Practical 2002, the majority of refugees from South Asian come from rural areas. The psychological scholars are even deeper from the longer years in squalid refugee camps with killing field. The refugees often found themselves trapped in poverty, private low-cost living, private receiving no help and all the benefits. The picture of America is starkly similar to even the situation of the poorest members of even the non-minority groups. The South Asian Latinos and African Americans have significant numbers of single-parent families. A quarter of households headed by single women. For the sake of preserving the non-minority, the conservative policymaker largely ignores the needs of the South Asian community. But the myth is false. Koreans are seen as a non-minority, but they are also the foreigner. This ideology of being in the middle called psychological violence came in 2008. Although Korean immigrants would be recognizing that words, the barriers of common race and citizens more forced within it. Asian Americans moving off the social life of islands, such backlash against foreign competitions, thus stunting assimilation, such backlash between the rationality of the modern minority and the foreign foreigner. The modern minority and the yellow pair form a circular relationship that is when moments when the Asian American become considered two modern minorities, the same moments in which you have the ostracized most virulently as foreigners. This racial discrimination underpinned the 19th and 20th century anti-Asian exclusion. The modern image can allow both representation exist side by side. The Korean Americans are simultaneously in both racial position. What I call foreign modern minority hood. The U.S. state electors and Indo creation is disturbingly parallel to U.S. construction of South Korean people, unfamiliar, unimportant, weak, some foreign. This accounts for racial ideology in both countries, but the myth also creates the discourse of the immigrant as a deserving poor, which justifies a decided black underclass as hanging 2000. The very few challenge opening laws was commonly safe for black underclass general migrate. Absolute instance Asian American poverty, reciting superior quantity to that of the black cultural poverty. The social sciences produced human study was organized to question presupposed mutual exclusion between blacks and immigrants in the other. The core assumption, so just that immigrants are inclined to social and cultural practices, which save them from underclass status. Here we're confronted with the environment of the discourse of the immigrant as a deserving poor. The location of the deserving poor is determined by behaviors that constitute cultural poverty. Behaviors that foreigners are organized in a way that guarantees survival, as opposed to the devolution of the black, decidedly black underclass. Now, our performance in the confrontation with the modern minority, we have rid white supremacy of the vector oppression used to police minority by. This resolved three impacts. One is the psychological violence against Asian Americans. Two is the oppression of other racial minorities who went to white supremacy justified through the myths. And three is the resentment of three migrant groups as China 93, history discrimination obscured by the portrayal a modern minority. Asian Americans are pretty hard way in telling us inside of belief in the modern minority allows to justify ignore the unique discrimination faced by Asian Americans and maternal prince and general quality ignore the needs. Dual point important racial minority pulling itself apart to become a mouse self-respect. The modern idea has become a largely unquestioned assumption of black and social reality. One can see as a label as a tool of oppression, which one denies existence of the presence of discrimination against Asian Americans, two legitimize the oppression of other racial minorities. The myth has gained a substantial value both inside and outside the Asian American community. The myth has created an audience unsympathetic for Asian Americans to be outside, to be without social service. Thinking Asian Americans to see the fish out deny funding for social service programs. College creation have excluded Asian American students from education opportunities. American men earn income compared to those white men, but they only did so by acquiring education. The income disparity from other Asian American groups are more resilient. Asian American family have more workers per household, more Asian American women compelled to work because of the band members who family such low age. Where disparity become apparent when geographical location consider the myth of a dual harm by supporting other racial minorities and poor rights who are blamed for not being successful. African Americans, Latinos, and poor rights told locals, Asians, anyone made in the country. This blame is justified by the meritocracy thesis proved by Asian Americans. We are complicit in the oppression of other racial minorities. This blame creates resentment against Asian Americans among African Americans, Latinos, and poor whites. The modern minority serves as convenient scapegoats as Korean Americans in Los Angeles discovered the virus. Many Korean Americans now view themselves as human shields, complementing the white majority and angle of the black minority. This modern minority made it and established a racial hierarchy with nice oppression of Asian Americans. Thus, Gabe and I affirm a process of conscientization to expose the myth of the modern minority that has been used as a justification for the position of the black body. Contention to conscientization. We often compellingly participate in a debate whether ever consider the possible debate to change the world. How the critical thinking and the research skill we develop can provide meaning and advance methodology to deliberate oppressed groups, often within our own social occasion. Our speech focuses on the epistemological growth occurring on TV and the development of the critical conscience. Debate becomes more than just a game, but a process of lead to conscientization. OCG 2007, the faculty of Asian American modern and classic government political found to find a way to ask a real possibility of young people critically conscious and politically active. Their active involvement in the order, given that the political should the right to wholesome student actors or driving ski out. These Asian Americans gone against the grain, become fully involved. They realize the political conversion where the 10 years of counter chance where people believe there's hope for the future. Common factor to develop critical consciousness. Our method is conscientization. It is a process of constant clarification that allows us to name the world and perceive how we exist in it. Through this dynamic process, we have already begun and will continue to create real change. As OCD in 2007, conscientization, being able to be found education right now to understand the impacts of social conditions, force, and repression, having realized the process of conscientization, false and constant clarification of what we're maintaining awareness of while we move on in the world and post-recognize the world lives and giving the world's words dynamically in the making. Such recognition of things inspires people working against pressure, being their active efforts to transform and naming the world and importance that towards actively changing and now experiential learning activities like today are necessary for conscientization. That's OCD 2007. The Asian American committed to develop an Asian American critical conscience, committed to social change, experiential learning activity, combined active order to relation, move students to the Asian American critical conscience, and our performance is critical. The debate has elements that contribute to conscientization that must be embraced for reflected social change. That's OCD 2007. The critical elements contribute to conscientization, important to obtain information and establish political content of life shaped by structural forward. The important bonus education or key social support made a difference. The school has to talk about the race of the Asian experience, inspired by the experience of the Asian Americans who struggle over complex and commit to Asian American issues, but deepen with the transfer understanding, international research, extend knowledge, and learn from efforts to maintain. Finally, conscientization arises when the discrete elements work in combination. It was not a purely intellectual experience as a social element, instead multifaceted and to relate experience reinforce each other. Though for active seeks to raise a critical conscientization Americans, success and solving content, related content fashion necessary for people to see themselves in a relation world. But there's a value need to offer a range of experiences across community, breaking for providing construction, often pick active programs to activity, conscious rights of people, exposing and provide lessons learned from a variety of sources. Now we should start this interrogation through history. This is the only way to challenge dominance that notion history current surrounding the U.S. We should be the United States federal government. That's Ego 2005. Knowing how history are influenced by means emphasizing how practice parents a tangible fact performing in history, reproducing, vindicating, exclusion, excluded. Such creating requires questioning how faith, history, celebrates the U.S. nation. This world after the United States, the world states frequently made on questions. Students are collection of past and nostalgia, continue to celebrate myths. The nation falls calls for understanding history through which nations are made and unmade. Understanding how the historicity of nations serves as an ideological alibi offers us a starting point. Increasing concern with issues of racism and historicity means that there is no unified knowledge, only contested subjects whose multi-layered and often contradictory voices intermingle with parts of history that are presented as unified. This represents an opportunity for genuine productive study, discussion, and learning.
Okay, regarding the Trumpenko evidence, how does the AF change the state or the way that the U.S. Participates in these racist policies?
It doesn't change the way that the U.S. participates in the racist policy. I think you're misunderstanding the Trumpenko evidence that says students within the U.S. need to interrogate these histories so that these histories no longer celebrate myths that prop up static notions of history as it does.
Right, so after we, the students don't propagate these static notions of myth, I'm confused on how that spills over to broader change.
Because that's tied in with the OCD evidence, because first, Trumpenko says that this increasing concerns with issues of racism and these types of counter-knowledges produce disobedience within these spaces of academia that make these histories come
It's
through.
not like a question about spillover, it's a question about what we learn through our process of conscientization.
Okay, I guess that's fair. So that kind of raised the question of how you change the judge's relationship to the world and how he kind of...
It's not about changing the judge's relationship to the world. The judge judges whether or not a method is a good or bad idea. If you want to roll the ballot, we say that the ballot should be who best performatively, methodologically liberates oppressed groups. And AF ballot signifies that our method of conscientization is a good one for that roll the ballot.
So how does the AF method of conscientization deconstruct the myth of the minority?
That's how our performance does it. We go through this process of conscientization through the exposition of the myth of the model minority and our refusal for the myth of the model minority that has currently used Asian Americans as a tool of white supremacy within society.
So I guess, how does that, like, I'm kind of trapped within the question of spillover. Sure that there might be a good methodology.
Why are you trapped in the question of spillover? I don't understand what this spillover claim is. The OCG evidence says this is a good method and should be affirmed because it leads to the type of recognition of how we exist in the world and leads to social change. If that's what you want for spillover.
How does it
if you want, like,
lead to social change? That's the last part.
Because you realize how you exist in the world. Specifically for Asian Americans in the context of performance, we realize that we've been used as tools of white supremacy. We realize there's this harmful stereotype that's been perpetuating resentment between minority groups, psychological violence of Southeast Asians, and the ones currently, and realize it is a myth.
Conscientization, what is constant clarification of how we name the world? Is that like the
it's a fancy way of saying learning.
No, that's like your tag, right?
I just said it's a fancy way of saying learning.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so the impact debate, your evidence, you read a piece of evidence that indicates that the model minority justified the oppression of like Latinos and like blacks and stuff. I'm confused on how did that spill over?
How did that spill over?
Yeah.
Well, in current society, Asians are used as foils for these other non-model minorities.
How are they used as foils?
Because conservatives point to Asians, be like, Asian Americans are doing so well. They prove the power of the free market and the absence of racial discrimination, because if they're doing so well and they're this minority, why can't you do it themselves? Two things about that. One, that's false because of the Southeast Asian, and two, is that's harmful to themselves.
All right, so on.
Defended?
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, just give me a second. I'll pull it up. All right, I'm good.
Awesome.
Our first link is conscientization, therefore front-loading the critical consciousness ability to actively prevent decolonization and material change. Tuck and Yang, 2012, we wonder whether another settler moves to innocence is focused on decolonizing the mind and allows conscientization to stand in for a more uncomfortable task of relinquishing stolen land. The front-loading of critical consciousness builds up in way to decolonization until stolen land is relinquished. The critical consciousness is not translated into action. The act strategy of consciousness raising is part of a flawed strategy of liberal anti-racism that reproduces settler colonialism that is the major cause of anti-Asian oppression. That's short elevation liberation 2012. Liberal strategies of anti-racism, liberals do not attempt to abolish the institution like military bases that produce stereotypes that keep us from subordinating. Our goal is not to enlighten anyone's consciousness, but to rather to expose the institutions of the process so we know who our enemies are. There are two systems of white supremacy that shape the renovation of American life and struggle. The first consists of the social relation formed by settlement in North America as the result of land stolen from American Indians and Chicanos. Settlerism has created terror, violence, and radical hierarchy where Asian Americans have to navigate. It consists of social relations formed through the expansion of U.S. imperialism in Asia through military conquest and the domination of corporations. And second is settler privilege and complicity. Discussions of immigrant struggles in America like the one you see must begin from a starting point in complicity with colonialism. Failures to recognize our own role in the colonial process reinforces the settler mentality. Kathana, 2013, settlers of color engage in the oppression of indigenous peoples. The successes of people of color happen at the expense of American Indians by entrenching settler colonialism instead of working to attain success by joining down in settler society. People also work toward justice and decolonization to reflect on their own status in the settler colony. Problematizing this relationship is necessary if I'm going to claim any sort of solidarity. There is no critical reflection on one's own role in reproducing the settler colonial state. We are so engaged in our own struggles that we have become unwilling to accept our own role in violent colonial processes. There are ways in which settlers can work for justice. This begins with the recognition of our role in the destruction of indigenous lands. The focus on difference and Asian experience with the white body. The one you see literally erases the ground on which we stand. This is a move to innocence. The short circuits the radical potential. The one you see settlerism must be a fundamental starting point. Patel 2013. I have often heard the people of color with left politics claim that our relation to this land is different. We claim innocence. We claim we say that we are coming from other post colonies and that we too are victims. Even when we recognize that we are settlers, there is no sense of urgency. I'm not saying that we share the same power as white settlers, whether we first came to this land as refugees or under the Immigration Act. We are all here now and we benefit from the same settlement process. We need to stop paving the way to lip service to indigenous sovereignty. Recognize that there are forces that dehumanize us. We are the same forces that continue the genocide of the first peoples. And our third link is progress. Every solid claim the one he makes is a representation of the racial progress under which current situation is a marker of indigenous disappearance. Smith 2012. The markers of racial progress are also markers of identified multiculturalism, existence, distance, and self-blackness with an expanded notion of the logic of settler colonialism. The primitive indigenous subject always disappears in the more complex evolved medicines, though subject to these signs of racial progress could be re-articulated as markers of indigenous disappearance or radical engulfment of the white self. Determining the subject, our interpretations of the judge should have an overwhelming negative presumption. History accumulates destruction rather than forwarding, and change presumption must go against the claims to specificity unless they have an alternative description of how time and history operate. Till in 2013, the president is possessed by the logic and protocols of racial capitalism, passed by a perfectly routine massacre that was and is replaced endlessly across space and time. Racial terror returns from a past that is not an end to a take hold of bodies, institution, infrastructure, and does not let go. Well, theory of time and accumulations around implications of how we understand the future. Traditionally, the future is a place of possibility, progress, and hope. When we imagine the future as the outcome of the passage of time, when the past falls away from the present, disappears, so that the future becomes relief from the devastating weight of everything that has come before. If time does not pass, everybody accumulates, and the future is not liberated from the constraints of yesterday, but rather is the place where the wreckage of then and now lives on. If there is no progress, but instead repetition, modification, intensification, reversals, and suspensions, then we know what the future will be like. The future will be what it was like before. The metric of your decision should be who best refuses settler moves to innocence. This performance fails to confront either their own embodiment of settlerism as a move towards innocence allows them to deny their own complicity while living, breathing, and debating on stolen ground. Tuck and Yang, 2012, the adoption of decolonizing discourse steps in the pre-existing tropes to get in the way of more meaningful alliances. To think of these tropes as a serious move to innocence in which we reconcile settler guilty, attending to what is irreconcilable within settler colonialism is what is incommensurable between decolonizing projects and social justice projects that will reduce the frustration. The settler moves to innocent strategies that leave the settler in freedoms of guilt without giving up land and power and privilege. Settler scholars gain from kudos for being so sensitive, yet settler moves to innocence are hollow, and failure to challenge settlerism makes persistent structural violence, ecocide, and social death inevitable. At least in 2013, the U.S. state reappropriates its imperial sovereignty through the double death, a twin execution that topically relocates its absolute outside and is already inside. The symbolic colonial rekilling of Geronimo discloses another form of death. This prefers that a living death also that embodies the existence of the colonized. This is experiments of academic failure, unemployment, a high death rate, and inferiority complex in the absence of any hope. This tends to make life an incomplete death. The ecocide has been visited upon Native Americans. Native Americans are viewed as non-people. They are scripted as expendable. Alternative is to refuse to sell or remove to innocence. Our bodies are already found guilty on colonialism. We must maintain the guilt as a process of refusing complicity and further acts of genocide. You should adopt an ethic of incommensurability to refusal of any combination of the settler mentality, white Korean lag, and other worlds of colonialization. This is the rubric and role of the ballot for evaluating rhetorical frames in the debate. Though this will likely be a permutation debate, our evidence says that you don't get it. Tuck and Yang, 2012, an ethic of incommensurability stands in contrast to reconciliation. Reconciliation is about rescuing a settler normalcy. What will decall look like? What will happen after incommensurability acknowledges that the questions will not be answered for decolonization to exist. The answers require an understanding of incommensurability that coalesces coalitional politics of only an ethic of incommensurability means abandoning the hope that settlers may be commensurable to Native peoples, means removing the asterisk and conditional clauses that punctuate decolonization and underwrites innocence. The Native future is unwritten possibilities made possible by an ethic of incommensurability. Decolonization is not an end, it is an elsewhere. And debates like this should not include artificial debate structures called a permutation. A debate about competing methodologies make these debate nonsense and takes any hope of effective engagement with an literature base. The community is beginning to transition to new standards of stasis and affirmation rather than sole topic focus, which is awesome, but the only way to ensure that we have debates that are fair and predictable is that both high quality and fair in a method focus is the most fair. It's the debate's most stable point to garner offense in the debate. Is the only way we can deter practices like framework conditionality that detaches responsibility from the one you see. And furthermore, this kind of appeal to flexibility and combination is the essence of the settler mentality. That's already to mutate. The desire to reconcile is a settler desire to be made innocent. Tuck and Yang, 2012. Everything within a settler colonial society restrains or destroys or assimilate the native is to disappear from the land. And the version of decolonization by settler social justice frameworks is one way the settler tries to escape the unbearable searchlight of complexity. The desire to reconcile is just as relentless as the desire to disappear. Another component of the desire to play Indian is settler, the desire to be made innocent and the mercy and facing the relentlessness of settler guilt. And the F can never solve the critique because the native subjugation doesn't function through identity or rather material. Historical conscientization fails to change anything. Trash over 2002. The issues before Hawaiians are those of indigenous land, cultural rights, and survival as people. The issue before locals is merely to do with finding income for pit. Locals don't want any reminder of the daily benefit in the subjugation of Hawaiians. The identity is not a problem, it's rather a problem for non-natives, including Asians. Asians have been thrown into a cauldron of defensive action by our national struggle. Either they must justify their continued benefit subjugation and serving as support for subjugation, or they must repudiate American hegemony, and it must be recalled that history does not begin with the present nor dies. Its terrible legacy disappear with the arrival of a new consciousness. Non-natives need to examine and re-examine their many and continuing benefits from dispossession, and these do not end when non-natives begin supporting Hawaiians.
Here's more.
We control the internal link to war and genocide. Settler colonialism is what makes it possible. In weeks 2013, the U.S. is conducting global shadow wars in Central and Western Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and Africa. Drones and orders a new weapon to choice. The U.S. speaks its name of global because it unfolds the extension of sovereign domain. This imperial drone archipelago has been enabled by domestic politics and imperial exploration of Native American lands with location of drone ground control strategies that militarize borders, disremember, and face the First Nation constituencies of people that fail to conform to the hegemonic country who's on the imperial state without a focus on foreign policy. There can be nothing domestic. The former is its task to precisely divide the latter by domestications of what was foreign. The U.S. foreign policy is on preventive wars, reenacts the violence, domestication, what is foreign, and to its formal constituents, establishment for the violent prehistory that comes from the Enochian foundation of the U.S. state. Self-inverted state.
Alright, we good?
Mark this.
Mark this. We good, right?
Yeah.
Roll the ballot, what is it?
Chris. Roll the ballot.
Yeah, what is it?
Okay, the roll of the ballot is whoever best refuses settler moves to innocence.
Whoever best refuses settler moves to innocence. How do you two do that?
Right, so the critique, like the entirety of the critique is based off of how we should confront our own role in this, I guess, colonization, as well as how we benefit from the colonization.
Benefit from it. So, what do you do about it afterwards?
What do we, okay, the question of what we do about it afterwards is kind of it's kind of a weird argument because the entirety of the alternative is beginning to realize how we are complicit so that we can't even begin to understand how we should address the issue until we do the alternative and realize our complicity.
So, what is this, how do you lead to material change that a lot of your impacts are saying are necessary?
So our evidence indicates that
And
by
what is,
maintaining this guilt, we refuse to participate in the systems of oppression, and by having this guilt, we realize our ethical culpability that would change our interpersonal relationships in the first place.
So your alt is white guilt, am I correct?
It's not just white guilt, sure. Like,
But okay,
that's
guilt in general, but
it's maintaining like a system of ethical culpability for
ethical
subjugation.
Cool. Now let's talk about some of these links. The Journal of Asian Liberation quotes, liberals encourage white people to question their stereotypes. How is the act not questioning stereotypes that white people have set to Asians?
Well, that link card is specific to other things, like liberal strategies to conceptualize difference as, oh, our problem is different. Well, obviously our link arguments.
What do we say our problem's different?
When I was reading through the 1AC, there were words like, well, we need to create difference between different Asian minority groups. We need to create difference between different minority groups.
There's difference between within Asian minority groups. Where do we say that this is different from the struggle of natives?
Well, the Journal of Asian Liberation evidence.
So, did you just say, where do we say that the struggle is different from
the
natives?
Kahina evidence. Quote, instead of working to attain success by joining dominant settler society, people of color must work through justice. How are we trying to join dominant settler society when we give it the middle finger?
You don't give it the middle finger, dude.
Really?
You change the system from within and fail to realize that, sure, there might be different struggles.
So you say we change the system from within. How are you two no different than that?
Wait, what?
You say that we try to change the system from within. How are you two no different than
The
that?
idea of working to change U.S. policy without refusing
Change U.S. policy.
Right. No, I'm not saying that you are reading a plan and trying to fiat it. It's like the Trofenko card that you read at the bottom of your 1AC.
Change U.S. policy. I found it clear that there was no spillover.
No, it's the question of how we deconstruct the myth in order to.
Now,
you literally said in the 1AC that you would be able to.
I want to take some prep for this last question. Are immigrant settlers?
Yes.
Yes. Why?
They also participate and benefit from the subjugation of native people.
Are slave settlers?
Our slave settlers?
Yes, our slave
Our
settlers.
evidence indicates that they, the initial, anyone who's participating in on-native lands, or within and subjugated.
All right.
20 seconds, please.
I'm gonna send out the, or just email out the card.
Full
card.
Can you see my Dropbox?
Yeah. I'm gonna set up. It's gotta be a case. I'm gonna answer. I don't know what MCK. Then I'm gonna go on to some more answers.
Is there a particular order for this case stuff, or just
The case stuff or the case stuff?
case
no.
to see? All right.
No particular order. You can probably just more fancy.
All right.
Oh, I have to pull it up too, just to.
Yeah.
Everyone ready? Yep.
Yep.
The one incident has throughout the impacts of the case theory versus psychological violence of the Asian American, we are always seen as on our presence not seen as legitimate because we always see the individual we are assigned to manifest himself. There's a welfare policy where Asian and Southeast Asian get confidence East Asian Americans are not given their welfare benefit, or educational policy where Asian Americans are seen as too smart to gain these health. The second impact is the myth of the model minority, which justifies opportunity against the elder minority, like legitimate support. But to look at these Asian Americans, why can't you do as good and prove that there is no neoliberal there's no racial discrimination in the free market, provide white colonialism a justification for not to feel guilty in the status quo. Colonialism will not turn the case impact because there's no reason why colonialism having white people will stop us from learning about the breaking down the stereotypes of the myth of the model minority. There's a specific one in Sealing Court says that we must break down these stereotypes, which is the whole point. We don't claim that we acknowledge that there is settler privilege that we have examined as Asian Americans. However, we must dispute the myth of the model minority. Also, the stereotype that accomplished which is now going to settlerism critique. I will answer all their one C card first here. The Tucking card, yes, it does talk about conscientization, but it talks about conscientization in the context of decolonization. If our affirmative was talking about that we should decolonize our mind by going through a process of conscientization, that would have played in the whole Tucker and Yang article is about how decolonization is not a metaphor. We're using conscientization to bring down the myth of the model minority. Does not turn the trustability of our the Journal of Asian Liberation card. Here are some quote liberal encourages white people to question their stereotypes and part of confronting their privilege. This is the alternative that liberal strategies only get white people to question their own guilt and provide white guilt, which is the types of questions where they only question their privilege and don't do anything for the decolonization. The second one is that they say they do not attempt to abolish the institution and reproduce the stereotypes to keep us subordinate. These stereotypes are the myth of the model minority. The concept of Asian American, which say they do not have any evidence of that we are breaking the third quote I'm going to point out is later we found ourselves because Jim Crow legal style. It's only that we have been championed as the model minority a supposed solution to the problem of militant black resistance to settler terrorism. So that historically the model minority, white supremacists portray the model minorities as a solution to the settler terrorists that black resistance tried to do, came to dissent that settler terrorists and to dissent that white guilt in these stats. But the second card, the Canadian card, is even more problematic for the here. It's like even if the successful people of the United States of Canada, such as assimilating into dominant capital structures as CEOs or other executives, happens at the expense of American Indians. Where in the 1AC are we assimilating to the dominant capitalist structure? The whole point of the 1AC was to go away from the second point, which we'll get on to the alternative behaviors later. He says that we can listen and react to the demands of the indigenous liberation movement. I'll get to that point to that quote later in the debate. Patel evidence. It says what does citizenship for rich black people mean in white settler colonies? Citizenship, right, are based on white supremacy, depression, and genocide of Aboriginal people. This assumes that Asian Americans are trying to get their citizenship from the white supremacy, and immigrants are coming to the United States to gain that citizenship. We are critiquing that through our gift card from the 1AC, saying that that form of assimilation is what we were trying to fight back. That white supremacy is using Asian Americans as a tool by giving them their citizenship, right, and being like, oh, look at these black people, these Asian black people, these Asian people are becoming citizens and being permanent workers in the United States. Why can't you do the same thing? The Smith card says that it's critiquing section policy of the anti-black. That's not the myth of the model minority. It's section, the politics of multiple cultures depend on the anti-black. So we say expanding notes of logic of settler clone and its analysis and rest of the indigenous critique. Smith is not critiquing the myth of the model minority, but it just simply says that it's portraying a person as universal in this anti-black form is bad, which we do not. Now, the alternative does not do anything. White guilt is just another facade for innocence of guilt, because now they can just be like, oh yes, I'm sorry for all this thing we've done in the past, but they don't do anything about it. White guilt just becomes another excuse for this desire on 13. White guilt is racist because it keeps attitude in discussion centered on white people. Well, I'm sure that feeling bad about what white people have done are doing to people of color. Oh well, the shit is not being done to us, and beating one's chest in public about it means that the attention is not being focused where it should be. Adding on the shit, but being done to people of color. Now the alternative is inherently contradictory. This was the quote I pointed out from the Keeney card. They tried to accept the indigenous people and tried to point out what the indigenous movement wanted. Even if they try to fight out, their cards are indicative that we must listen to the indigenous people. We say no, that's wrong. You cannot bring the fight against settlers into a colonial audience to do so towards the entire critique role in the indigenous nation and inspire distinct counter to a method for dominance of society. Invitation that indigenous people speak the truth. What settler society here for is to fix the inevitability that indigenous people want to release from the imposed duty to justify this turn into massive investment energy back into practice. The undermine colonial privilege, colonial power works through a dialogue to shatter the vitality of the practice. They have been induced to justify them to the colonial audience by these efforts, whether they came from these settler powers. There are advantages to promote the more dialogue to change to a important method of maintaining control of discourse. These sorts of narcissistic settler now. In the case of the alternative silence, in this case, is the best. Colonizers need to stop being the audience for the critique role in 13 dialogue is preemptive struggle in the research of promoting indigenous nation tales confronting colonial institutions with greater fear of silence. These signs are signal generally in the it's autonomy from a post to be to justify existence, the nonsense colonial so that like it's not that silence that protects the injustice, or if silence and erase the native people will continue to speak to one another rather than deciding to speak by themselves when we are neither the object or the arbitrary slavery. Now the end of the cross, if we ask if this slave and immigrant was slave, yes, maybe immigrants who come here and assimilate into dominant forms of the colonial side have that segregation, but the Henneken slaves in Mexico, Korean slaves brought into Mexico do not have this. Also, the Tucking article concedes that slaves were not part of the settlers' colony, but the settlers relied on the slave labor to allow the colonization. Tucking 12 cattle or commodity later slavery present on the land is accidentally being dislocated. The settlers making a new home. In order for production, he needs labor. The chattel slavery served as that labor. The less settlers dwells his land. No pay for the labor is impossible. Settler neutral, whereas the indigenous and the chattel slavery are under the settlers are not immigrants. Immigrants are beholden to indigenous law. Settlers the permutation rate versus the permutation to different strategy for different people. We can refuse decolonization as a metaphor, as they're talking and they talk about it to go through a process of incommensurability. We acknowledge our settler privilege, but that does not mean that we should not break down the model minority stereotypes that are present. I will answer their preemption permutation to make sure to allow these permutation. Yes, there's a statement that takes shifted into a methodology debate. However, you cannot just say that just if our methodologies are not mutually exclusive or not competitive in any way, you cannot just say, oh, our oppression is better. This leads to a style of oppression living where the negative just racist to get the biggest type of oppression, just be like, oh, yeah, we solve for more things. So your alternative affirmation should not be saying, and rather this should not be about the impact, but rather about the methodology. It prompts the conscientization and what the affirming stand for, which is the breakdown of these stereotypes, which is a colonial legacy, and otherwise debate just devolve onto whoever can get the best impact, which is just the current form of debate right now, the current form right now debate. Also, Michael, what was that police card?
The checker G-check.
Alright. Now at the end they read this police card which talks about drone strikes, how drone strikes impact how drone strikes are only possible because we have stolen the native land for these drones, and if you don't give it back to them, then you do nothing. Prince or this forever phone or this card is talking about the stereotype is driven by the migrants, which proves that we also solve for this too. Also, I'm going to attack the impact debate. Do not let them play that settler colonialism is the root cause to everything else. To do so would be the same type of colonizing discourse where they don't have to talk about the specific type of oppression that some immigrants face, like the Henneken Mexico is just another move for the settler because they can't just claim this overarching. You have to have a specific interrogation and historical analysis of how the settlers and colonialism came about. From our analysis of the journal Asian Liberation Study, evidence that you read settler colonialism, yes, they allowed immigrants to come here, but they have settler colonialism, a lot of assimilation, integration. Yeah.
Also, the Dylan card, there's no thing such as presumption because one constitution does it, and also we acknowledge that history is something.
Dylan card doesn't make sense in the context of affirmative because at the end we acknowledge that history is important. However, the way we examine that history is our process of conscientization, and that's critical to breaking down these typical stereotypes that have been presented against Asian Americans.
First piece of evidence on the all. Where do we assume white guilt?
You say that. Let me read your alternative text for you. Our alternative is to refuse cell moves to innocence. Our bodies are already guilty on colonialism.
Alright, fine. The first card, IR13. White guilt is racist because it keeps attitude and discussion centered on white people.
Yeah.
The card is like 3 lines. Who's qualified to write about Asian studies?
Yeah. This is not about Asian studies. This is a blog about.
Yeah, so here's the blog. So who's qualified to write about problems with...
Sorry, I don't know the exact author for you. However, it's just logical that white guilt is just another way for white people to be like, we're guilty. Now we don't have to do it.
So we're having this discussion of the best starting point to resolve some form of problems
it's not
the entire world, and we're letting
it's about
blogs.
Methodology.
Alright, who's qualified to write about this?
This is a logical argument that white guilt, like white people can be like, oh, I'm sorry for racism, I'm sorry for slavery, I'm sorry for killing all the
and then they don't do anything. Where are the contradictions within the alternative?
What contradictions? Are you talking about a Rule of 13 card?
Yeah, the Rule of 13.
Well, I cite your Community 13 card, which is that, let me get the quote. That says that we can listen and react to the demands of indigenous liberation movements. The Rule of 13 card is that to counter settlerism, and to have a true decolonization, you can't just let the indigenous people keep on talking to the colonial audience. He says that what has prevented solidarity, indigenous solidarity right now is that indigenous people try to justify.
How does the AF interact with...
the AF doesn't interact with that argument. It's a reason why you're alternative and contradictory in the way you present it to a colonial audience.
I'm going to take some time on the permutation debate. You pick the starting point. You didn't defend
Methodology,
U.S.
not starting
federal.
point.
You picked the start. No, let me finish. You picked the starting point. You didn't defend U.S. federal government action. You chose what you got to talk about. Where's the fairness behind getting a permutation?
And one, not about starting point. The starting point is about a methodology. You say that debate should evolve to have interpretive debates about which, like,
Where's the benefit
best
from
way to
combining?
affirm a
Where's
record.
the benefit from combining methodologies?
It's not
And that
combining
will always
methodologies.
You
lose.
just say that
The thing is, like,
two can coexist.
like the thing is, like the entire half of the 2AC was attacking why there was no link. Your cards were cut out of context and how they do not apply to the myth of the model minority. First, you have to win a link to say that they're like contradictory, that we're like co-opting your performance.
So if we win
Second,
a link, do you get the
no,
permutation?
the permutation.
That's how debates work. If you win a link, we don't get a
Okay,
permutation.
fine. I just want to clear some of this up because it will likely be a permutation debate.
The permutation also, all your cards are not in the context of me and Michael going through a process of conscientization is bad. You have proven that maybe conscientization in a sense of decolonization is
The
bad. but
Dylan
not that
13
main one.
evidence, the no link argument is just that we don't interact with problems of history.
No, we do interact with problems of history. You provide a counter history of Mexico.
Okay, that's fine.
Alright, Juniper.
Cool.
Never mind.
This just proves that the model minority was the solution to that black center resistance. When black people started resisting this.
Yeah, I get it.
So I'm going to start, I guess, on the case with an overview to like stuff.
So before your overview on the case?
Yeah,
Okay.
we're gonna do like an overview on. And is it okay if I use your standard?
Yeah, sure.
And then I'm gonna go straight down on the critique.
Cool.
You are correct.
So I'll put that separate.
So, yeah.
How much time do you have? Oh,
3:13, yeah.
we're using 8 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Alright, whenever you're ready.
All right.
Social designator of the people outweighs the average U.S. is created outside of the inherently inside indigenous peoples recognize it's valuable non-people living in incomplete without any hope. This allows for the oppression to be justified. The American colonizer after countering the natives unjustified expanding abroad through imperialism as well as racism and independently leads to things like ecocide. We can justify destroying lands that isn't ours, and empirically leads things like tax, waste, dumping on native lands. We control the internally to their impact empirical expropriations as the extension of the sovereign domain. We use foreign policy to find the domestication of other words in order to establish the political and territorial sovereignty with the U.S. The construction of the domestic state with sovereign power allows us to delineate between us and the external other, allowing for the construction of the model minority. We haven't conceived the solvency. The critique directly address the questions of the solvency debate, but only the critique is able to solve the affirmative. The formation of settler privilege led to stereotypes in the first place. In the alternative, the case can't solve the Nebraska evidence that indicates that the question of identity aren't able to address the questions of native subjugation because native subjugation aren't built over the structure of the oppression, but rather the material wealth that they lost in the native subjugation under the first colonization that occurred. Going to the critique line by line, first the link debate, settler moves to innocence, erase the ground on which we stand the acts of Conscientization, because a certain innocence, the minorities, the oppressed body, incapable of taking part of the oppression themselves. They ignore the fact that we all benefit the colonization process, our link turns, the case same genocide, the first people, that is the mindset that justified the humanization of racial minorities. That was above, and first link is G for conscience rising interrupts colonization. Strategies like anti-racism and conscientization are root to innocence. Yes, are detecting evidence specific to their evidence, their strategy. We feel that we're combating the colonial mindset, but with a failure to recognize the settler perpetuating who creates structures of oppression, conscientization, they stand for material change. The link alone turns the institutions of colonialism to define the construction of anti-racism. Things like military base and the military corporation to manufacture these stereotypes. The advertising they imagine they say that we are not a full decolonization, but it's not just about the metaphor, rather how we raising consciousness to strive. One issue was not about Chicano and native peoples. They haven't read any evidence about the material subjugation that happened, which means that it is a direct proof of our argument in the first place. It's not just about it's about the question of the starting point. They say the Journal of Liberation evidence is not specific. First is that they highlighted a part about liberals questioning white privilege. No, this doesn't. It's not. The alternative isn't white privilege in the first place. How will they be expended? They explain the link debate, but they say we don't abolish institutions, but we can't abolish institutions. But the alternative is changing our interpersonal relationship. Our evidence indicates that our goal, I quote from our evidence, is our goal is not to enlighten anyone's conscience, but rather to expose the institutions that oppress us, so we can know our enemies, who our enemies are, which means that our alternative is a prerequisite to smashing those institutions in the first place. We can't do so until we know who our enemies are. Next argument is that the minority, the model minority, is not that is able to solve the oppression, but their evidence is not the context for the quote they write is that the racist rationale that creates such an identification for Asian Americans is further explained below, and then he goes on to explain that it consists of the social relations formed through the expansion of U.S. imperialism in Asia through military conquest and the domination of corporations that was formed by the settler privilege in the first place because we allow ourselves to dominate other nations. That was on the police evidence explained in the overview. Next argument is that they don't assimilate into capitalist structures, but that the settler privilege and complicity is the link argument not just about assimilation and destruction of the affirmative attains that success the recognition of their own role in oppression and colonization of indigenous people. They'll undoubtedly say that they combat white supremacy to say they solve the impact of that, they engage with their own struggle and give priority without accepting their role in violent colonization. They act as merely lip service. They say
It's not a critique of assimilation. They said the Smith evidence is a case of multicultural studies, but no, the progress link is that the narrative progress erase the indigenous struggle. Our interpretations of the judge should have an overwhelming negative presumption because the judge should refuse to believe that the act effectively changes any substantial change in the should vote negative presumption because the bar should be extremely high for the act because our evidence indicates that time does not pass, it accumulates in the violence of the current world repeats endlessly across space and time. It's not an argument why they have to focus on history, but rather an argument why they lead to no change in the first place. We should decimate absolvency. They read a piece of line from the Smith evidence, but it says that the expanded notions of logic of settlers colonialism, and they say it's about Sexton, but no, it says that the signs of racial progress could be re-articulated markers of indigenous disappearance, and they act as an instance of that sign of racial progress, and not the conventional notion of racial progress, i.e. gaining more assimilation and power within the state, but rather freeing themselves from the state process in the first place. The next argument they make is that white guilt doesn't do anything. Our evidence is about why white guilt is bad, but because we don't focus on others in the first place. That was made clear in process when Harrison read that is the only words in their evidence, but the alternative is reject settler move to innocence in all peoples, maintaining guilt and recognition of our old role in continuing the genocide, maintaining people's refuses complicitly and further acts of genocide, voting negative in sense of recognition of our colonial violence as white people, but rather a vote to maintain and cultivate a sense of ethical culpability for all of our roles in violence. Madhu, as a male living in the global south, you have to affirm the process you cannot affirm the process of conscientization without recognizing your role in the colonial process in the first place, and the ethic of incommensurability is that the world on which we can't stand cannot be made ethical. The alternative is recognition of that the fight against white supremacy is a game of chess. They focus on eliminating a single piece which destroy the entire board upon which the game of white supremacy is played. Instead of analyzing the particular tools white supremacy uses, we need to understand the material logic that allows for white supremacy to manifest itself in the first place. They say we live the Rollo evidence in the context of us solely listening to indigenous people in the first place. Yes, our evidence says that that is a possible strategy, but that's not the alternative. Our alternative is not simply listening and engaging in dialogue with indigenous peoples, rather realizing how we participate in the subjugation of those peoples in the first place. Next, argument that settlers were slaves were not settlers, but even if slaves aren't settlers, you aren't slaves. Our evidence in the context of how racial minorities in the status quo perpetuate this refusal to confront our own role in the subjugation of natives, because we do not question the benefits that we get from those things in the first place. It's also an offense for them because it doesn't indict our scholarship or a reason why our thesis about the world is false in the first place. The permutation debate will be in the one in our video. They say the next argument after the permutation that say we have to give the land back. No, our evidence indicates that we have to know how we participate in these structures in the first place. We have to realize our ethical culpability in order to change the world. They say no root cause, but the alternative is a crucial starting point. First is prior to extinction of the native peoples, ensure the end of all life. Only the alternative can reshape the globe and solve managerial control of the status quo. That's Tinker in '96. The recognition that indigenous sovereignty is a priority was necessary. The rethinking of consumptive patterns such an act would have a significant role effect on the ability to take the world culture and value that preserve the reimagining the Western values of survival and making Indian culture make a difference for the survival and the survivability of all the earth. We know the loss of productive of these people, the survivability of making fellowship relying recognition of indigenous political sovereignty, and B, spurs other movements and failure to give it historical priority. The history of the United States colonialism makes nothing more than the redistribution of Howard Logan, the direct the occupation of Native North America, because achieving success in decolonization spurs other movements. That's Churchill '96. The battle waged upon neighboring nations to free themselves from battle ends upon which they find enough for ongoing resistance to suitable peoples. The Griffith U.S. internal colonialism, part of the liberation progressive, or the U.S. imperials abroad and the racism at home and deliver blank stare to the press, open dissension from indigenous land rights, or mention the set of what's happening in common groups with the issues of the worst sophisticated stage to diverse discussion. Harrison will finish that evidence.
Your Journal of Asian Liberation evidence, you said we read out of context, and you said that the model minority was a product of colonial domination, right?
The model minority, yes, was a product of...
Okay, if we're stance against the model minority, then why isn't that a stance against colonialism?
What?
If the model minority was a product of colonial domination...
Right, that's like you kind of eradicate a symptom of cancer, but you don't like eradicate the cause, right?
And you eradicate the cancer, right? Because you have a cure for cancer?
Right, that I guess like, are you asking like alternate solvency? That's
no,
kind of a jest.
The way I work into that. Also, you said on the card that our goal is not to enlighten anyone's critical conscience, but rather to expose the institutions that oppress us, right?
Yeah.
Okay, if that's true, what's the difference between exposing critical consciousness and exposing institutions?
Right. It's not just exposing institutions in general. It's a question of what institutions, what I guess systems of oppression we expose. Right.
I'm asking the difference between that and learning. If we expose institutions and gain critical consciousness, what's the difference?
You gain critical consciousness over the wrong issues, right? That the
wrong issues. So you say that like white supremacy is not an issue?
No, that's not. Like that's totally twisting my words, dude. Like. We're not saying that white supremacy is an issue, but it's a question of what we focus on in the first place, right? The
what issue we focus on? Okay. So you say that one of the link is that we try to get racial progress, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The question is, how does the alternative resolve colonialism?
What?
How does the alternative resolve colonialism?
So the alternative resolves colonialism because we realize we have this ethical culpability, right? That we change our interpersonal relationships in accordance and realize that we also support these subjugations.
And that leads to destruction of colonialism?
That once, our evidence indicates that once we realize our role, I guess, that we would be able to know how to take action.
Okay, so you will be able to know how to take action. Why is that not a story of progress?
Why is that a story?
Why is that not a story of progress?
No, our Smith evidence in the context of racial progress in general and how this concept of multiculturalism and the multiculturalism behind the affluent.
Right.
I looked through all of your evidence.
Yeah, I have 45 seconds to process
okay, that's
and
fine.
I want you to explain how Asians are used to perpetuate colonialism.
How Asians are used to perpetuate colonialism? What do you mean by Asians are used?
You said that everyone's complicit in colonialism. How are Asians complicit?
Right. So your presence on stolen land means that you are complicit because you are structurally responsible for taking away the land. You have 25 seconds. That taking away the land that these peoples once lived on, and that you are responsible.
My ancestors took away the land, immigrating here to the United States. Is that what you're saying?
What?
So my ancestors took away the land, right?
Not just that we're not saying that your ancestors were responsible and that they were the ones that were responsible for the first genocide, but it's that
We'll take a breath.
Okay.
I'm finishing this part which
is right after discussion begin to.
Which link was that? Was on the floor?
Yeah.
It's just like the link of...
Oh, okay, so I'm gonna finish that all part of the
That's the reason why it's yeah, I agree. Are you finished right?
Yeah, okay. Let's start on that.
I'm good.
Okay, I'm gonna finish that Churchill card, starting with the word more important topics, because Chris marked it in into, and then it's gonna be permutation.
And we have 56 now.
Okay. And I sent out a document with the cards and everything.
Is this the Churchill card that you're finishing your document?
Yeah, I'm starting it more. It's towards the top and middle of the card. Alright. I'm good. Okay.
More important topics in which justice becomes synonymous with the redistribution of power and loot deriving from the occupation of Native North America, even while occupation continues, in which the great mass of non-native has become much to gain from the success of native people. The diminishment of U.S. material power is integral to the victories and stands to pave the way for realization of the most agendas from anti-imperialism, deliberations succeeding with any or even all of these other agendas will represent an inherently oppressive situation. Realization is contingent upon an ongoing occupation of Native North America without a consent of Indian people. Any revolution which failed free indigenous territory would be simply a continuation of colonialism. Liberation of the land. First and foremost is key to fundamental social change and many other sorts. Now the permutation debate, framing the debate should be around which methodological stance is best for approaching depression. If we win this argument, it proves that we don't have to win offense necessarily, just prove that our strategy is flawed in the first place. The negative's only burden is to prove the affirmative wrong. If our links prove the affirmative wrong and our impact arguments prove the affirmative wrong, which was the thesis of the 2NC, then the affirmative never actualizes their change, which is a reason to vote negative and prove to them why they were wrong. I'll do the method debate here because we will frame the debate. Method focus is crucial. First, we need to focus on who conceptualize strategies in the first place. Any skirting of this through a permutation means they're shifting their advocacy, which has a few impacts proofs. First, one, subpoint A is they aren't able to meet this own role of the ballot because they indicate that they have to be an unconditional approach to breaking down the model minority myth. Any permutation proves that their analysis and advocacy isn't genuine. And subpoint B is that it destroys methodological action. We have to focus on the individual methods in order to determine whether they're desirable. Not crucial around the modeling of any of their advocacy. Marking the starting point is incoherent. Next is fairness. We need a stable point of offense to garner in the debate. They have to be held accountable for their advocacy statement. Only by focusing on method can we disincentivize framework conditionality that destroys the only links we have versus the F, and this lowers the threshold of the impact we have to win. If we win that our advocacy is a better methodological strategy for resistance, this means we should win the debate. And even if they get firms from a theoretical standpoint, substantially they embody the settler mentality. Firms are whiteness, and that's just another link. That's the same move to innocence that our link arguments outline. Their 1EC evidence is in the context of why whiteness shifts. It embodies the model minority with and papers over combining strategies is this same papering over of different methodologies, and it leads to the same impact that they criticize in the 1EC. The thesis of the last piece of evidence that they read in the 1EC, or the middle part of their F, is that white people have papered over Southeast Asians. They're papering over another way to settle oppression, which is the reason why the permutation fails. Now, the ethics of commensurability, 1NC Tuck and Yang evidence proves the perm is incompatible as an attempt to reconcile the settler mentality, but this ethic of incommensurability is the recognition that we can never compare the suffering of racialized minorities that of indigenous people. The perm is the same type of compromise, the politics that we criticize. Additionally, there is an integration disadd to the permutation. The perm replicates the liberal model of pluralism, which attempts to wash away the feelings of the 1EC. Decolonization must be grappled with on its own terms. As well as 2012, incorporating indigenous self-determination to movements and subordinating and compartmentalized indigenous struggle within the leftist narrative. We have to be cautious not to replicate pluralism, forging indigenous identities within our existing narratives. Indigenous struggle cannot simply be accumulated with other struggles. It demands solidarity in its own terms, and the permutation is a link. Alternative cannot be grafted into the 1EC despite its critical anti-racism. Is the very possibility to decolonize. It was to recreate settler whiteness or creates theory to extend the innocence of the settler. Tucking Yang 2012, this kind of exclusion is a form of inclusion, domesticates decolonization. Decolonization is not a metaphor. When metaphor invades decolonization, it kills the possibility of decolonization or resettles. Theory and extent to innocence of the settler entails the settler futurism. Decolonized and decolonization cannot be grafted onto pre-existing discourses, even if they're critical. Adoption is standard or form of settler appropriation. Now, they don't get the perm, but even if they do, permutation is for permutation do both is incompatible in severance because it shifts out of our link arguments. If we win a link argument, this goes away. It separates out of the method of the 1AC. Now, the other permutation that he vaguely extended to the bottom of the 2AC is permutation or refuse decolonization, conscientization, acknowledge other things. Obviously, that would be an intrinsic permutation. Do not let them shift the permutation in the 1AR. This debate was muddled in the 2AC, which should give you a lot of leeway for the 2NR reapplying the permutation. And there's a footnoting disadd to the perm, irrespective of what the permutation does. The alt solves the case, but the perm ensures continual colonialism. That's Churchill 96. The usual technique for explaining this away has been an acknowledgement that Indian land rights are important, but the one really doesn't have a lot of time to get into it. Typically enumerated are racism. There are serious problems of primacy and priority embedded in the orthodox script. The society resulting from this scenario is still a colonialist society in the most fundamental sense possible. The principles of this sexism, racism are all rest arose here as a concomitant into the emergence and consolidation of the Eurocentric nation state in the form of a social, political, and economic organization. Everything is contingent upon its maintaining internal cohesion. Realization of indigenous land rights serve to undermine or destroy the ability of the status quo to continue imposing a racist, sexist, classist, homophobic, and militaristic order on non-Indians, and pluralism decided the permutation. Both the perm and the 1AC place decal within a pluralist framework creates a false equivalence that proves they'll never solve. Lawrence and Dunn 2005, decolonization politics are equated with anti-racist politics. Such an ontological approach places decolonization with anti-racism within a liberal pluralist framework which centers decolonization struggles. We become one component of a larger anti-racist struggle. Such pluralism marginalizes decolonization struggles and continues to obscure the complex ways in which people of color participate in the project of settlement. Decolonization struggles must be foundational in our understanding of racism. It's a short-term understanding of race and racism and the relationship of people of color to multiple projects of settlement.
So you finished that, correct?
Yeah.
656. Okay.
Alright, I'm ready.
You sent it. I know you didn't send it.
saying here. The case is overview and the case. The terms at the very bottom, am I correct?
Yep.
Yeah, cool.
Give me a sec to pull it up.
Gotcha.
All right, I'm good.
Alright, both of you ready? Okay. Yes, your impact is better, but it's going to be a question of alternative and methodological solvency. You have dropped out our method. It's good. Conscientization is a process to break down the myth of the Maori, because Asian Americans exposed it. Asian Americans believe in the myth of the Maori, which is the reason why giving the Maori performance of rejecting that myth of the Maori is independent solvency that you can actualize in the room. Do drop the terminal impacts of psychological violence against Asian Americans, because Koreans are always forever more. People like the Southeast Asian get papered over in the status quo. They don't get off for a bad mistake or modern society. You've also dropped the impact causes the resentment between minor groups, which is a reverse solvency deficit, because if you're going to decolonize the status quo, you have to get rid of the tool that white supremacy uses to pit these groups against each other. His own overview, you do not solve any of this. Equal side arguments, you have to actually give back the land that's Canadian indigenous practice, which Whitefield obviously doesn't do in his status quo. He says that we use it justify for the domestic military bases. You do not solve these military bases overhead. It's not tourniquets argument, because tourniquets assume that you win the alternate solvency. Now finally he says that the case can't solve because identity doesn't solve. There's a fundamental issue here when your alternative is based on the identity of keeping people guilty. You are not a material change, and the Western cross-examination made that extremely clear. Now here's also a fundamental uniqueness claim. But all is going on in this status quo. People empathize with the Native American, but the Asian American oppression makes people angry because they didn't even know about it. Challenge 93, the myth of sparks resentment preventing Yahweh tells us the reaction of religion to gospel Asian American right. Once people believe that she was offended by his military toast, some of these celebrating if gospel was gospel military. They said they were not offended by any of the Black American Chicago or Native American right. They understood and emphasized with their frustration expressed by Native American, but the Asian American made me angry because I didn't even know that Asian Americans felt oppressed. The myth of the Maori renders the oppression of Asian Americans invisible. Now Willie K. Proper, he starts by saying that we are selling moves to innocence. No, we are freaking not. They temporarily have to break from the notion that Asians are some minority who is superior. We acknowledge that this is a tool of oppression that we benefit from, which undermines the thesis of entire creed. Now I'm going to attack all their evidence. The first link of Conscientization doesn't apply because the Tucking indicts Conscientization is a process to decolonization. We're not using Conscientization to achieve decolonization. We're using it for something else. Also, you link to the same logic. If Conscientization is a standing for material change because we don't challenge material questions, then what the hell does being guilty do? It is a same logic that they talk about. Link doesn't turn the case because you don't do anything about the material structure going on in the status quo. It's not a question about starting point. It's a question about now John Levis. We weak the John Levis. We are questioning the stereotypes that uphold our privilege. We to the reason why we meet this card go. The card also goes further to say that these stereotypes are subordinate. The act is consistent with saying that stereotypes are subordinated. We are saying that the myth of the Maori subjugate Asian Americans current society. He said that the alternative would change internal institutional relations. We already know who the enemies are, which is the reason why you don't do anything new. And also don't lead to any material change because you not actually engage with the institution, which is a prerequisite of all your cards. Now he says that we are complicit with the silence. First of all, the way you should frame the complicity link is assuming that we affirm the United States federal government, we affirm the stolen land, that we are debating all in the status quo. We are not that. We're explicitly giving it the middle finger by saying that the United States federal government took Asians and made them immigrate here to use them as white supremacy. We are doing that. Now, the modern minority was a solution for the established protect by our rights, and this is your own evidence. This has two implications. One, this means that the case towards impact because we were the white supremacy of de facto oppression using police minority rights, and two is a sovereign destruction placing the official justified. Now, he says the Smith evidence of progress, and you are progress too, because after the material change, what needs to happen in the status quo? The progress links to you too. It's a rearticulation of affirmative, which is the reason they have dropped the evidence that the Patel card assumes that white supremacy gives us citizenship, except we do not link to the status quo. Now, the alternative solvency debate, the alternative nothing. It's just white guilt, which is the reason he's trying to say that it's just rejecting establishment for all their privilege, except that means that you're not actually listening to the indigenous people, not letting the indigenous people do themselves. The two cards I read after this, after the contextualize this, saying that we should not bring indigenous people knowledge into a colonized space like debate because you need to let them do their own thing. They do much to make an actual strategy. They incrementally arguments and presumption arguments don't win because Conscientization or social logical negativity. And this is just common sense. The world can be made ethical, and the most different evidence cites people of how people went out to do that. they realize there's political version in the science school of Alexander Silence arguments and the altitude of contradiction. Although altitude of contradiction, because you cannot speak for the element in science school, it is justifies colonial violence because it trades off with their own violence in the science school, which is the reason why your alternative cannot solve and the old material change cannot solve. Now, finally, the slaves are selling arguments in that to knowledge because it proves that immigrants are not selling in the science school because we have to see the fact that slaves cannot be considered college because it cannot be complicit with these in the science school. He said the Tinker evidence, except you cannot solve the Tinker evidence because the alternative obviously doesn't solve the key to making the valid shape of life and the recognition of indigenous political sovereignty. You do not do indigenous political sovereignty. All the Churchill evidence says that you need to give back the land. The alternative doesn't do that, which is the reason why you do that. Also, the Churchill evidence proves that you have to abandon Orthodox realism. That means that the alternative is something radical, like give back the land. Whereas they can never solve anything in the science school. Now, finally, the permutation. Instead, you should bring the permutation as different structures with different people, which is the reason why the permutation is just the reason why the methods can coexist. We're not grafting onto each other. He makes a lot of arguments, but a lot of it are not responsible. We're not shifting our method either. The fairness argument, you have to impact on the fairness because it says that if we don't get permutation, that means that teams will just race to the biggest pressure Olympics, which means that we'll never be able to tell the perms are not whiteness because we are not trying to paper over. We're not trying to graft it onto us. This is just saying that they can coexist. Even if they win the ethics of incommensurity, the only implication is that our strategy has different goals. Yes, we agree with that. This doesn't disprove that the two can coexist in the science school. He says integration this. We're not integrating you internally. He says the perm is a link. You use perm as an metaphor. We're not grafting. He said footnote this. He said you do not realize indigenous right, which is the reason why you cannot solve the war in the footnote this. The pluralism this doesn't link either because we are still doing it for the same goal, which is to resist white supremacy. The reason why the permutation solves.
3:13.
Yeah.
then straight down the K page, and then continue with the per.
Cool.
Everybody ready?
I'm good.
Impact arguments only go one way. They all solve the same to the link argument, meaning that in the case that it can annex the K, a recognition of indigenous sovereignty necessitates a rethinking of consumption and patterns in the north has ripple effect on other states. That's our tinker evidence. In the case of the survival of indigenous cultures, solve sustainability globally. American Indian peoples have values that can be corrected with the Western values in the modern world system, which means the alternative solves the case and resolves modern oppression, but only the case can't solve the alternative. The alternative evidence indicates that the success of native people also spills over recognition of indigenous sovereignty necessitates amendment of U.S. material power and paves the way for realization of other agendas from anti-imperialism to racist liberalization. The only answer they have this card is that says that Churchill obviously talks about giving back the land, but no, our evidence in the context of engaging in native sovereignty and realizing our own complicity in the ways that we refuse for them to become sovereign again in the first place. The Church case argument only go one way. That was about the LIF can't solve the K because the absolute represents the inherently oppressive situation and the realization is contingent upon the ongoing occupation of Native North American without the consent of Native people and revolution, which failed free indigenous territory was simply a continuation of colonialism, and independently they have conceded the social death arguments that our evidence indicates that when we posit the Native is socially dead, it allows for other the exploitation to occur in the first place, which it means that even if they resolve psychological violence, only we resolve why psychological violence occurs in the first place, which is through the Native being made as expendable in the first place. You get they say they get rid of the tool of white supremacy, but no, you get rid of a chess piece, but only the alternative gets rid of the chessboard in the first place because we refuse the game to be played because we refuse for our own participation with the oppression in the first place. Yes, we solve for military races. This journal liberation, Asian liberation argument indicates that when we know our enemies, we're able to smash them in the first place, which means that even we don't know our enemies in the first place, we don't realize our own complicity in the scenarios of oppression, and even if we don't result in material change, we still solve because we still resolve in the interpersonal relations that allow us to change our relationship towards indigenous people and refuse our settler moves to innocence, which allows for more change in the future. And no, there's no native emphasis now. The alternative, obviously there's no native emphasis. We feel that we equate things like anti-racist movements and decolonization as movements. They can see the Lawrence and Dua evidence. They say it's just about white supremacy and resisting it, though this is the link argument because when we allow for those anti-racism and decolonization to be correlated, we refuse to focus on natives specifically, which means that they aren't able to absolve oppression in the first place. No, only the alternative is able to solve because it resolves the chessboard arguments go to the K proper. First, our first technique evidence is not about decolonization in the first place. It's distinct and indicates that when we focus on other things other than decolonization, doesn't have to be it can be critical conscientization or any different strategy that doesn't directly address native struggles. That means that we as a settler move to innocence because we resolve other native struggles that we resolve other struggles without focusing on the native in the first place, which interrupts decolonization and means that conscientization acts in a stand for actual material change because even if they resolve our personal mindset, they don't resolve the reason why those personal mindsets are oppressive in the first place. Next, they question stereotypes, but no, this isn't what our settler privilege and complicity argument is about. We don't know who our enemies in the status quo because we don't realize that it is us. Our evidence indicates that our technique evidence indicates that they merely pay lip service to the system, or they engage in their own struggle and give it priority without accepting their role in violent colonization because they still exist and privilege from these native lands in the first place. Yes, they are complicit. That was above. They got rid of the vector oppression that was entered above. I'm not going through the progress link, but it doesn't take out the alternative because it's just the reason why our interruption within the debate space is, it's not a question of whether progress is good or bad, but racial progress being good or bad, the alternative is not an instance of this. They say, no, they don't listen to indigenous people into the colonial order, but no, that was answered about they do refuse to focus on the indigenous struggle. And next arguments, they say we lead to colonial violence, but no, the alternative is to refuse settler roots to innocence, maintaining guilt, is recognizing our role in complicity. We're not saying that we have to bring indigenous into the colonial struggle. We realize that we participate in those struggles in the first place. Going to the permutation debate, if we went the link arguments,
the Hua evidence indicates that they created false equivalence, which means the alternative is never possible because it simply papers over these structures in the status quo. They say they're not whiteness, they don't integrate, but no, that is the structural link argument because they indicate when we prioritize other issues, the native struggle is always deprioritized because we believe that we've done enough by focusing on our own oppression of the status quo, and that should be enough, but no, it is not enough. Our churchill evidence indicates that we have to challenge the question of native subjugation first. It's not a question of native sovereignty and giving back the land. It's a question of our own values and our own complicity.
6 something. 625.
Yeah.
So I just got this cheat sheet.
Sorry, it's from my debate partner from high school. He just chatted coup and was like, "Hey, I heard your judge is an idiot."
Yo, who's judging BG or C?
Capital. Check for that too. Yeah.
Case critique. Ready?
Yep.
You will sign your ballot affirmative because you have no idea how the alternative is able to resolve any of these impacts of colonialism and case turns the crap out of the critique versus there is no real effect. It doesn't help relieve anything about the model minority. What about the ripple effect? What about recognizing their own white guilt and complicity? It's able to help nations to recognize their own complicity in the model minority. What realization? The case is the entire realization of how we have been used as stereotypes, how we have been used as tools of white supremacy, how us assimilating to a white supremacist culture perpetuates its violence against the other Chicano whites and Latinos, and how that causes the myth of the model minority. You have no idea how the realization of your guiltiness stop the psychological violence where Asian Americans are always swept under the rug, where oppression has always been visualized, where benefits of self-existence like welfare policy or educational, where Asians are seen and to say that you are guilty may allow your realization, but it doesn't do anything to change the colonialization. It doesn't do it also. The resentment argument turns this back because if all the minorities are presented between Chicano, Black, and Asian American, because Asian Americans are always perceived as a small minority, then this realization doesn't lead to any change because they will always be fighting with each other. Now, natives is not a root cause of anything because it's not the root cause of everything because people don't know about the oppression of Asian. This is the take hard reality stated taught by professors literature class where they read texts written by Black authors, Chicano authors, Indigenous authors, and Asian authors. They were able to emphasize the Black Chicanos because they recognized their oppression. But with the Asian Americans, they didn't realize that Asian Americans were oppressed. They didn't feel like the Asian Americans. This has two implications. It means the alternatives already don't understand that people are emphasizing and not doing shit. And also it means that Asian Americans aren't feeling they're complicitly with the violence, which means that affirmative is the alternative only the first step to feeling that we are complicit. Now the chessboard analogy does not make sense because we are the people who made the chessboard. Churchill and the concept of giving back the land, which means you have to have something radical, which they do not do. Just recognize the guilt. Now the negative cannot win. Root cause claim if the ad is a solvency that's in terms of critique. Why does settler resistance not appear all over the? Why doesn't settler resistance movements appear all over the U.S.? Well, according to their own Journal of Asian American Liberation card, blacks resisted settler colonialism back in history. But what did the whites do? They used a model minority myth to call that resistance, point to the hardworking Asian American and prove that this is discrimination. So the model minority was a tool that white supremacy used to quell this resistance to stop anyone from fighting about settler colonialism. You cannot go to the critique. First is the talking gay evidence. Yes, it does say conscientization, but what it's talking about is using the concept of decolonization. The title of the article is decolonization. It's not a metaphor, and therefore we cannot use conscientization as a metaphor of decolonization. That is not what the affirmative. We come with our own version of how we have been portrayed as model minority, and using these stereotypes that we break down the stereotypes. The struggles are not the struggles do not matter because we are not a move to innocence when we are acknowledging how we have been complicit with that model minority. Also, what does the alternative do about the decolonization metaphor? This is more theoretical bullshit when they just say that, oh, we can be guilty and that somehow solves for colonialization. It just seems to be another move to innocence, which an alternative does not do. Now, the second evidence is that Asian Americans are complicit. The explanation I got in cross-sex was that Asian Americans are on the land of these settlers. This is problematic when you see that immigrants were not settlers and slaves were not settlers. But the second argument is that we are recognizing, you said that we have to recognize the enemies as us. That is exactly what the one is doing. We recognize that we have been portrayed as model minorities, that we have been perpetuating these stereotypes, that we are always in the middle, that we always are being used as a tool of white supremacy. The one is a stance against it, saying no, we will not assimilate to the current norms of white supremacy and stop that. Also, what does being guilty about it do? Just being guilty, just is that yeah, we recognize what who our enemies are, but that doesn't do anything. We're not able to articulate what happens when you kill. When you become guilty, and that's just another move to innocence. Now they have to see the alternative. Now you have no articulation. The two are what the alternative. Hey, you're having a process of conscientization, which is naming a word, learning about a word, exposing these institutions, which is a better method to break down any sort of better methodology to break down white colonialism. They conceded that the alternative would involve bringing indigenous people back into the colonial audience, where their voices just get commodified and used by the colonial audience just to seem that they're trying to decolonize things when that actually does not happen. This is another move to innocence. I mean, the alternative can never solve now the permutation debate first. They have conceded again it's different strategies for different people. That means that me and Michael can go through a process of conscientization and they can still be guilty. However, this is a strategy of coexistence because there is absolutely no link of us going through a process of conscientization, recognize is how we've been using for tools strategy. It does not paper over the struggle because it means that we're not grasping your struggle. We're not grasping decolonization or conscientization. We're just simply saying that there could be a bridge between that we can all attack decolonization, but through a positive conscientization, and you can remain guilty, which means that we're not papering over the struggle because the model minority is the justification colonization, and we do not need prioritizing native because we are speaking from our identity, and that's how we go through a process of conscientization to get rid of a tool colonization and perpetuated this stereotype and Asian Americans as hardworking. If we break that down, that's the first step that first takes to break that colonialism.